What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Transitions to Democracy. I'm very happy that you're with us tonight. Very happy to be here. We're continuing our discussion about monitoring trends and focusing on what we've called the democratic decline that the world is currently experiencing. And if you'll recall, we've painted the picture of a grim portrait of democratic backsliding across more than a dozen countries all over the world. And we focused on how this process has been gradual. It has been a process of legal decay that has involved tilting the democratic playing field, suppressing opponents, concentrating power in the executive, and all sorts of other dirty work. Today, we're going to continue talking about this set of patterns, but we're going to take a bigger look, a broader perspective, where we focus on some of the historical patterns that came before the current period. We're going to take a look just at how unique the current period of decline is. And if it's unique at all is a question that remains open as we start this discussion. Now, we're going to begin by focusing on this notion of waves of democratization. The democratic decline that we are observing today, it wasn't always this way. We've already learned in this class that between 1972 and 1999, but also 2006, the number of democracies nearly tripled. This was a period of rapid and sustained and intense democratization throughout virtually every region of the world. And over time, it came to be that 57% of countries in the world adopted democracy. It became the only legitimate alternative to an authoritarian regime of any kind in the world, in the words of Samuel Huntington. Now, Huntington was a well-known political scientist, very controversial for some of his ideas, but nevertheless, he coined the term the third wave of democratization. And he referred to this period as the third wave of democratization. Now, a wave of democratization is a group of transitions from non-democratic to democratic rule that occurs within a specified period of time. Now, during the period, democratic transitions significantly outnumber transitions in the other direction. This is basically like a kind of combination or a set of transitions that takes place in a given place or in a given area or during a certain period of time. And what you'll see is that we've had three such waves of democratization. Now, these waves of democratization have been distinctive and have taken place at different times and spread across several generations. But what we begin to see is that the third wave is really just one wave among multiple waves. And the third wave came after the second wave, which came after the first wave. And during each of these periods, the number of democracies worldwide increased substantially. So substantially that much of the world was transformed, especially after the third wave, where the biggest change of all took place, all the way up to about 57% of countries registering as democratic. But these waves go back to about 1800. And Huntington identified three such waves, as I've already mentioned. Now, these three waves are, the usual suspects, if you will. Between 1828 and 1926, the United States granted suffrage to virtually all white males, and the beginning of what was called Jacksonian democracy also sort of initiates the beginning of this first wave of democratization. Then France, Britain, Canada, Australia, Italy, Argentina, etc., all transitioned to democracy within a short order. And after the Russian, German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires ended in 1918, the wave saw about 29 global democracies. And so at the time, that was a substantial change over the course of about, 100 years. This was the first wave of democratization, the first long wave of democratization. This saw all those old industrial powers that we now think of transition. The second wave of democratization took place between 1943 and 1962. And this began following the Allied victory in World War II. After the war was over, one of the ways that the victors in the Second World War, imposed their sort of order was by sort of forcing countries to undertake democratic transitions. This was often a way of kind of weakening some of the original powers that waged war from within these countries. But nevertheless, for our purposes, you should know that the Axis powers, for example, underwent transitions to democracy. In the second wave of democratization that kind of included these various transitions after the Allied victory in World War II lasted about 20 years, and it crested in 1962 with about 36 democracies during that period. Now, the picture we're looking at here is actually Japan. And Japan was one example of a democratic transition that took place after the Allied victory in World War II. And it was sort of wrapped up in the context of the end of World War II and in the victory of the Allied powers. Now, the third wave of democratization is the one that you know best and that we've discussed in class already, and that sort of sets the stage for much of our discussion. This third wave, of course, took place between about 1974 and 2006, and it was launched, as you know, by the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which took place in 1974. Portugal was a transition through regime defeat, a transition through rupture, as we called it. But Portugal led the way and was followed by Latin America, where most countries transitioned beginning in 1979 and through about the mid-1990s. Most of Latin America, with only some exceptions, underwent those transitions at that time. So it was really region-wide for Latin America. The Asia Pacific, including the Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan, also saw transitions between 86 and 88. These hung together in the same sort of general pattern. Eastern Europe in the post-Soviet cases, and Sub-Saharan Africa went beginning in 1989. And so these were also clusters of transitions that characterized the third wave of democratization, as Huntington called it. Now, let's take a closer look at Latin America, just to give you a sense of how much the region changed between 1979 and about 1995. So in 1978, only Colombia, Costa Rica, and Venezuela were democratic. That's a tiny little sliver of a region with many more countries than that, dozens. But by 1995, only Cuba and Haiti were still authoritarian. And so virtually everyone, including Paraguay, had transitioned by about 1995. So within the space of about 12, 15 years, 17 years, 18 years, quite a bit of change in Latin America. And then in the late 1990s and early 2000s came more democratic transitions after the color revolutions in the post-communist states. So these transitions are the ones that we know best, and these are the transitions that we'll focus the most on in this class. But the reason that I'm highlighting these different waves of democratization is to give you a lay of the land and give us a sense of where different transitions have taken place and when those took place. And really more specifically, how they tended to kind of take place together. So here's the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. It's such a colorful event. It was characterized by the sight of military movements that restored democracy, but also, of course, roses and carnations. And it was the Carnation Revolution. So you always see photos of like protesters on tanks with flowers and stuff. So that's Portugal. But let's take a look at these different waves of democracy and democratization. Remember that first wave began in about the 1820s. So we start about right here, and we go through about the 1920s. So from about the 1820s to the 1920s. So this is kind of the peak of the first wave, and it kind of comes to an end in the 20s. This period from about the 1820s to the 1920s sees the first wave of democratization. The second wave of democratization takes place after World War II, where Europe is liberated and Africa is decolonized. Asia also transitions in some cases. After decolonization, we saw then the third wave beginning in about 72 with Portugal and Greece and Spain, Latin American countries, the Philippines, communist countries in the 80s and the 90s, African countries. So we see then these three waves of democratization scattered across time, giving us a sense of the lay of the land in the development of democratization processes worldwide over time. And this is interesting because by now it should be obvious that the current democratic decline that we began this discussion by talking about ended the third wave of democratization. You probably noticed that 2006 marks the end of the third wave of democratization. This is kind of how we typically understand and agree the third wave of democratization came to a close. Within the literature, there's a sort of consensus that 2006 was a turning point for the pattern of continued democratization in the world. And what was interesting is that this sort of decline and the end of this third wave also seemed to indicate a kind of recession. And I want to ask you before we continue, if this recession is unprecedented, is this decline something that the world has experienced before? Have there been periods of decline in the past? Or is this kind of a new thing? Is this a new phenomenon? Are we witnessing democratic decline for the first time? Or has this happened previously? And I'd like to hear from you. Use the chat if you want to do that. You might also take the floor and make a comment if you wish. But I want us to pause and sit back. And I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible about this question. Martin asks, just a quick question. Does the type of democracy help increase the survivorship of democracies globally, such as presidential democracies versus parliamentary democracies? Good question, Martin. This is a question we'll actually take on. We don't think that there's actually much of a difference between the consequences of presidential versus parliamentary democracies for regime survival, but we do know that governance can be affected by the type of democracy. So sometimes presidential democracies are more vulnerable to gridlock because of the tensions that can arise between independently elected legislatures and executives. And sometimes that can weaken democracies. But there's not a firm consensus or a firm idea that either type is fatal to the survival of democracy. But good question. John says, I don't think this is new. The rise of fascism, I believe, is the clearest example. Totally. We can think of Mussolini and other examples of the decline of democracy in Europe. And of course, this goes hand in hand with what eventually happened after World War II, where many of those same powers were forced to return to democracy. So John seems to be on track here. Ishan says, I think that the democratic decline had previously occurred during the Great Depression in the 30s, with Italy and Germany falling under authoritarian rule. Arturo says, well, there has been a government change as the times change. We went from monarchies to representative democracies, but for some reason, fascism is happening again. Okay, so there's certainly been change over time. Absolutely. And it may be that we've seen a similar decline during previous periods, and that this current recession is not new. What do the rest of y'all think? Are there other ideas? Gustavo says, I think that the decline of democracy isn't new, but the scale at which this declining is happening maybe is new. Okay, so it could be the decline has happened in the past, but maybe it's more intense right now. That's certainly possible. What's interesting is that we can actually look at the data and see if that plays out in the data. Gustavo. What do the rest of y'all think? Is the recession unprecedented? Have we experienced decline previously? Is this something new, or is this something old that we've experienced before? What do you think? Is the recession unprecedented? Have there been periods of decline in the past? Okay, so let's move forward. So periods of decline. Oh, we got a chat here. Let's check and see what it says. Jose says, I agree with Gustavo. A decline in democracy has increased. The original democracy, such as the Greeks, was eliminated by monarchies and imperial rulers throughout ancient Europe. Okay, so that goes back a little further than what we'll look at, but the basic idea that there have been changes is totally valid. That certainly is true, and I think in some ways history repeats itself, as we'll maybe see here in a moment. But to answer the question, periods of democratic decline are not unprecedented, and in fact, the trend that we witness now, we've witnessed before, and in fact, Huntington himself had a concept for such periods too. He called it a reverse wave of democratization. So a reverse wave of democratization is a group of democratic countries that revert to non-democratic rule, leaving fewer cases of consolidated democracies behind. This is basically a wave of democratization in reverse. It's countries reverting back to authoritarian rule and returning to autocracy after an earlier transition to democracy, thus leaving fewer cases of consolidated democracy behind. The first wave, the first reverse wave, reversed the progress of the first wave of democratization that took place between 1820 and the 1920s. And that, of course, set the stage for then the second wave of democratization. But that second wave that was brought on by the end of World War II was then reversed by a huge series of democratic backsliding events throughout the 60s and the 70s throughout the developing world. And so reverse waves of democratization are just as common as waves of democratization. And what you'll see is that those reverse waves resemble in some way what we're experiencing now, but are also unique and different in some ways as well. And their similarities and their differences is the place we're going next. And I want you to pay close attention to whether or not the current period of decline is unique and whether it's more frightening or less frightening as compared to the previous episodes of decline that we've observed. Will we talk about conspiracies here? There have been rumors about a new world order. We may discuss conspiracies. The international determinants of democratization might relate to that discussion. We'll see if we can incorporate that, Arturo. Okay, no problem, Daniela. I'm going to be posting the lecture, which is being recorded right now, so you should be able to catch up and view everything that you might have missed. Sorry for the trouble. John says, the other thing about the reverse wave is that I don't think countries tend to revert to the same type of autocracy as they had before. It's usually a new type of regime. For example, there are no countries that abolished their absolute monarchy and then brought it back. Hey, good point, John. This is a relevant point because the types of regime do have certain characteristics that might predispose them to extinction or to revival. And so I think that that's a good idea that you're pointing that out. In general, these reverse waves of democratization have been a feature of history as long as we could remember, at least going back 200 years. And the basic dynamic is what you see before you. It's this kind of surge toward democracy in the form of a wave of democratizations, and then a reversal, backsliding, the kind of breakdown of democratic regimes in the return to autocracy. Of course, that return to autocracy doesn't continue forever. It eventually is the case that a new wave of democratization will appear and democracy will surge ahead again and will once again attain a great appeal throughout the world. But sooner or later, this second wave of democratization is brought to its knees and is reversed by yet a new reverse wave of democratization, and so on and so forth. We've had 3 waves of democratization. We've had 2, maybe 3 reverse waves of democratization. And the question of whether we've had 3 is a question that I'll pose to you momentarily. But I want you to notice this, and I want you to think about what this might mean for us if we think about, for example, does history repeat itself? If we look at the record of democratic transitions the world over, and if we look at these waves of democratization and these reverse waves, does it suggest that maybe history repeats itself and there's some cyclical dynamic, some cycle that is playing out over and over before our very eyes. In a moment, we'll take a look at some data that helps us to begin to wrap our heads around that and try to answer that question about whether or not history is repeating itself. But before we do that, let's take a moment and look at some of these different reverse waves. Now, the first reverse wave we associate with fascism, of the kind that we've already discussed here and that I've already heard a few of you mention, associated with Benito Mussolini, Nazi Germany, and others. This really began in 1922, the first reverse wave. This was just after the kind of apex of the first wave, because when the first wave reaches its climax, it begins to fall shortly after. And in 1922 was when Mussolini rose to power in Italy and began a course that would result in the collapse of a lot of new democracies. Okay, so Italy went down, and a lot of those democracies that went by the wayside were those newly formed democracies that had only come about in the last few decades. And what we see and what we saw is that those new democracies, they could not combat expansionist, communist, fascist, and militaristic authoritarian or totalitarian movements. Those fragile new procedural democracies were incapable of suppressing these anti-democratic forces and these anti-democratic movements. Those movements rejected democracy wholesale. Fascism in particular was completely dismissive of all democratic forms and procedures. And this wave, this reverse wave, lasted about 20 years. And at its very bottom, the number of democracies had dropped to a mere 12. And so all the progress that took place over the previous 100 years was basically reversed in the space of about 20 years due to the dynamics around conflict and war and nationalism and expansionist, communist, fascist, and militaristic, authoritarian, totalitarian movements. And so we saw then, from the very beginning of the first reverse wave, a role for these fascist sort of authoritarian movements that had no patience for democracy whatsoever and were unwilling to accept democracy as the way of organizing political life. Can you specify which democracies were affected by this wave? Yeah, so like, for example, Italy, Japan, Germany, some of these better known cases, the Axis powers, these types of countries. Lots of smaller countries that aligned with those different countries. The second reverse wave. The second reverse wave came after the second wave. And remember that that second wave characterized the post-war period when a lot of those Axis and linked powers were forced to undergo a transition back to democracy as part of demilitarization and as part of a return from conflict. But that second wave of democratization would only last so long. And by the early 1960s, the reverse wave that took place over the next couple decades was in full swing. And what happened here was that a lot of the countries in Latin America and Africa, like say Argentina and Chile, Ecuador, Peru, but also African countries that had been decolonized and democratized after World War II, a lot of these countries reverted to authoritarian rule. And they did so due to a variety of circumstances. In Latin America, for example, the economic model that democracy depended upon, the kind of continuation of, began to collapse. And there was a lot of discontent and a lot of discontent with democracy, and people were willing to put their faith in authoritarian alternatives. And so the military became really, really important in Latin America because it was usually the case that authoritarian regimes took the form of military rule. But that was also the case in a lot of African countries as well. And so the second reverse wave was particularly repressive because of the organization of authoritarian rule. And of course, the first reverse wave involved fascism and untold death and murder and bloodshed. So all these waves are repressive, but they're repressive in different kinds of ways. And so the second reverse wave was characterized by a lot of bureaucratic authoritarianism and military authoritarianism. So a particularly violent, repressive form of authoritarian rule. Now, the reason that I want to set up this discussion is because the biggest debate of all revolves around whether or not there is a third reverse wave and whether or not we are experiencing a third reverse wave. This is a critical debate because it has to do with the way we view progress and democratic backsliding. Whether or not we think of this as a third reverse wave has all sorts of implications. And it matters because whether it's a third reverse wave also influences how easily or difficult it is to get out of the decline that we're currently experiencing. So the contours of this debate are relatively straightforward. There's a lot of disagreement about how serious this backlash is, how serious the current decline is, how consequential and impactful the democratic failures and transition failures have been. Some people, some scholars, some draw parallels to the breakdowns of democracies in the 1930s and the rise of those fascist movements and those demagogues like Mussolini and Hitler, also authoritarians in places like Japan. A lot of people think that what we're experiencing is similar to those kinds of movements and that what we see is increasingly fascist in the same way that those movements were fascist. But there's also another position in the debate. And the other position is that the world is still more democratic. It's still more developed. It's still freer than ever during the 20th century. And this is the polar opposite position in this debate. The question then is, how wide and deep does this current trend cut? How deep does this pattern go? How serious is this pattern of democratic decline that we observe today? Does the trend amount to a third reverse wave of democratization? And this is a debate that I'm encouraging you to enter into. This is a debate that you can take on if you want in a paper in this class, but it begins with a discussion in this class. And I want to put it to you right now. Are we experiencing a third reverse wave of democratization, or are we experiencing something less? I want to ask you, and I want to pause, and I'd like to incorporate as much input as we possibly can. And I'd like to hear from as many students as we can so that we can have a very robust discussion about this. Let's get as many perspectives as possible. And I'd like to encourage you to consider the reading, but also to consider your own understanding of the situation and what your sense of the situation is. And so I'm going to pause and I'm going to give us some time to really reflect on this question and to consider everything that we have and all the material available to us in taking on this question. So Edwin has started the bidding. Edwin says, I believe that we are experiencing a third reverse wave of democratization, but Edwin adds that it is much slower and harder to determine. Now that's a really good observation. You know, it could be that we're experiencing this third reverse wave, but it's qualitatively different. It's slower, it's gradual, it's more difficult to determine or tease out. Good, good. So you're noticing then that it may be similar, but also distinct. Maria says, I would definitely say that there is a third reverse wave because there has been less democratic progress in countries. Yeah, Maria. So, you know, if we look at 2006 as kind of the cutoff point, if we remember our data that we looked at, there has been a slowdown, and we know that that was kind of the end of the first wave, or excuse me, the third wave. And so if that was the end of the third wave and the end of progress as we knew it in that wave, doesn't that mean that's the beginning of a reverse wave? It's a good question and a good insight. Ian says, I think that we may be on the precipice of a third wave, but aren't quite there yet. I think Ian means a third reverse wave. Yeah, kind of on the precipice. Ian, what I would ask you is, so we're really close. What do you think has to happen for us to sort of begin that third reverse wave, for it to kind of become officially a third reverse wave? I'm wondering if there's kind of like a threshold where you think there would be a tipping point and things would kind of change for the worse. But I think that that is a very interesting idea, Ian, that we could be kind of on the precipice and maybe it's close to happening. Santiago says, I believe we are experiencing a reverse wave of democratization, but at a slower rate. Okay, so it's kind of maybe happening more gradually, more piecemeal. Maybe it's happening under legal disguise, or it's a process that's drawn out by the nature of the attacks being carried out by these executives concentrating power. Ishan says, I think that the amount of democracies in the world should be considered relatively to the amount of the peak of the democracies at the time that the backsliding began. While the autocracies are rising to the same degree as they were in the past, as well as the backsliding be considered slower than in the past, it is undoubtable that there is a third reverse wave of democracy. Now, Ishan is on to something really interesting here, everybody. Ishan says, and I want to repeat this because it's so useful for us, I think that the amount of democracies in the world should be considered relative to the amount of, at the peak, democracies at the time of the backsliding began. Good, right? So we're kind of like examining, okay, well, how many democracies are there today compared to when the backsliding started? And what does that let us conclude about how much of a reversal there has actually been? Ishan is all over this. And what I want to tell you is that here in a moment, we're going to do that together. I have the data, I have the numbers. And so we can look, and I'm actually going to render a judgment here at the end of the lecture where I kind of draw a conclusion from the evidence that we'll analyze together. So hang with us, Ishan and everyone else. I think that we'll be interested to see what that data shows and what those numbers suggest. Daniela says, I'm not sure if it's a reverse wave yet, but right now it seems like it. It's probably because it's something that hasn't been witnessed before. Daniela, that's a really good point. As has been mentioned by some of your classmates, the process of democratic decline as we witness it today is different than it ever has been before. It's a different type of decline. It's more of a legal deterioration and kind of a slow, gradual deterioration that takes place kind of under the auspices of democratic institutions, but that kind of involves like gutting those same institutions. And so that's a different kind of decline. And what that means then is we might need new conceptual and analytical tools to understand this reverse wave, if there really is one. And so I think that's a really good point, Daniela, that look, this is something new, and whether it's a reverse wave might depend on whether we're able to look at this for what it really is in its own unique context. And Daniela adds as well, and a lot of these democratic policies have become reversed. Yeah, so Daniela, that's right. A lot of the rules that we consider to be democratic and so essential, like, anyone can run for office, sometimes those are reversed by electoral rules and systems and changes put in place by would-be dictators who make it impossible for their opponents to challenge them in elections. So these kinds of reversals that take place within domestic polities, those are really consequential. Those kinds of reversals are happening in a lot of countries. And so from that perspective, that's a reversal of a very important kind. And I'm so happy that you're picking out what's happening at the domestic level and what's really sort of going on inside these systems, because that decline is unique and it is different. And if we don't acknowledge for what it is, we might not pick it out as an example of a reversal. Juan says, I think that due to the current events that happen within this year, there is so much that could lead to the assumption that we could be starting a third wave, a reverse wave, I believe Juan means. But there has been so many things that we have no idea what we as a people that reside within the United States would do without the structure of the government. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and whether the United States fits this pattern is also sort of a question that we've discussed already in this class when we talked about backsliding. And I would encourage you to also think about, does the United States fit into this wave as well? And if it's vulnerable to this kind of backsliding, where do we see the United States going in the near future and in the more distant future? So thank you, Juan. John says there is probably at the bare minimum some sort of stagnation with a few exceptions, but countries like Belarus, Syria, etc. were already authoritarian before more recent events. Yeah, that's true. That's true. There are those cases that have persisted in their authoritarian regime, and those cases might not be as relevant to our discussion, right? Or at least we can say that those cases don't really support the idea of a reversal because they've always been authoritarian. And so the persistence of those authoritarian regimes might not be as consequential as the failure or the breakdown of those democratic ones that we thought were good to go. But you're exactly right, John. Cases like Syria and Egypt, those are authoritarian regimes, and they always were authoritarian regimes. And so what they tell us is different than what, say, the case of say, maybe Hungary, right? A recent example of democratic backsliding and breakdown in Eastern Europe. That's maybe going to be different than the case of Belarus. Ian says World War III. I think there was a question that I was asking.
Yeah, you asked me what I thought the tipping point was going to be.
Oh,
that's what I think the tipping point is going to be.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because we've already seen World War II exerting kind of an impact on like regime transitions. And so it makes sense that if there was a World War III, that it could also really disrupt like regimes at a domestic level. So, it's hard to think about what World War III would look like, maybe, or maybe it's easy to think about what it would look like. But I agree that that could be a tipping point if there was ever to be one. And so when that happens, I guess we'll have to hold on tight. Yohel says, adding on to what Ishan said, perhaps the bureaucracy is what is slowing down the process. These moves to autocratic tendencies are disguised through legal means. Good, Yohel. Yeah, so this is what we observe throughout the cases. It's a case of legal deterioration, right? It kind of happens within democratic institutions, not outside of them. And so it's difficult for us to pinpoint when democracy ends. And it's hard for us to distinguish between how much a democracy has deteriorated versus maybe another one, because the legal changes could vary and it's not as obvious or evident how the cases are similar. And so this deterioration through legal means is really difficult and hard for us to study with the same tools that we studied, say, the first and the second reverse wave of democratization, where it was much more like overt military coups, like fascist takeovers, stuff that's really obvious, stuff that's not at all democratic, doesn't even pretend to be democratic. Karen adds, I believe we can be experiencing a third wave of democratization given that lots of people in our country are unhappy. I think Karen means a third reverse wave, are unhappy with events surrounding the elections, which can either discourage people to participate in voting or can encourage them more than ever to participate. So good, Karen. I do want to encourage you to think about how the United States fits, because this is our experience and we can learn from this case. And we can think about how it is different or it's similar to what we've seen in the other cases that fit the pattern. Carla says, I feel like depending on what happens next, if things continue to decline or improve, it would determine or make official or reverse democratization. Good, good, Carla. Good. I actually have something to that effect here in a moment. And I'm so happy that you would pick that up, because I think that what Carla is pointing out here, everyone, is that we're in kind of what's called a critical juncture. This is a moment where the normal constraints on action are lifted and we can go in any direction. And which direction the world goes in might be contingent on what happens next in the short term. And so the world might become more democratic, or it may become more authoritarian based upon what happens in this sort of critical moment we find ourselves in. And I think that Carla is onto something there. Whether it's going to be a reverse wave or not might yet might still be yet to be determined, but it's probably going to be determined by what happens now. And so we're probably in the middle of history in the making. Martin says, I would say that there is a reverse wave of democratization. This is seen through the rising turnover rate that South American and African countries face. Potentially, it wouldn't be like the unified reversal faced around World War II, but something more resembling individual states turning to authoritarianism because of their executives. Yeah, so Martin, like others, is pointing out that it's going to be different, right? If the reversal is taking place, it's not going to look like the fascist takeovers and the military takeovers of old. It's going to be something in like individual states choosing authoritarianism through their executives, basically, executives who might tilt the playing field, suppress the opposition, abuse the media, dissolve democratic institutions, sort of surreptitiously. These kinds of actions, like what we saw in Hungary, what we saw in Central American countries. Jose says, I would say that this third wave of democratization is still holding up, and it is slowly breaking down in some areas of the world. I believe that a third wave of reverse democratization is upon us, but there must be some tipping point throughout the world to instate authoritarian rulers. Good, Jose, good. Perhaps a major war or maybe the extension of this pandemic. That's an excellent point. I'm so happy that so many of us are open to the possibility that that reverse wave might take place, but that it might require a tipping point or something that kind of begins or initiates the process. Very good. It could be a world war. Maybe the pandemic weakens democratic governments and makes authoritarian alternatives more attractive to any voters who might abandon parties or democratic institutions, or any actors who might support authoritarian alternatives. So democracy's rivals might be strengthened by some of these crises that we're experiencing right now. And what happens to regimes could be very, very consequential, especially if there's some tipping point that begins this set of processes. Arturo says, they are even happening in the USA. If the USA falls, wouldn't all democracies fall? So Arturo, it's an interesting question. Certainly the United States has a lot of influence in the world, and the United States has historically promoted democracy in a lot of places. Would democracies fall if the US fell or reverted to authoritarianism? Good question. Maybe that would give force or impetus to authoritarian alternatives in other countries. It could be that US allies find themselves more vulnerable to democratic backsliding if the United States became authoritarian. But I don't think that all democracies would fall. I think that there would actually be plenty that would survive. And it probably would be the case that some other country would become the sort of supposed mantle or exemplar of democracy. And whether the United States remains that is sort of a separate question. But I think that generally speaking, I don't know if it always is going to hinge on what happens to the United States. I think that the US is only one player among many at this stage and at this point. So a good question, but certainly unclear if the US would be that consequential if it did collapse. Santiago says, maybe democratic decline is at the tipping point and we are in a reverse wave, but we just don't see it. In the readings for this week, it talked about how some authoritarian regimes like China, Iran, and India shut down internet services and mobile services to smother the news of violence. So if these authoritarian regimes are hiding what they are doing from the world, how are we to know what that we are not already in the reverse wave? It's a good point, Santiago. It's a good point, especially if we aren't able to understand what some of these would-be dictators in places that remain democratic but are teetering on the edge of collapse and reversion to authoritarian rule, especially if we don't know what they're doing because of this smothering of the news, that could be really problematic. But I think to answer your question, we already know that places like China, Iran, and India, although maybe less India, are mostly authoritarian. And so we pretty much know what regimes exist in most places. It's just a matter of sort of what are they doing under the covers that we're not able to see or understand fully on the surface. And so I would be more concerned about countries that are democratic, but that might be teetering and on the edge of reversion to autocratic rule. Luis says, I think we are experiencing a third wave, but those countries that are switching to an authoritarian rule are much more democratic than the past regimes and the waves beforehand. Good, Luis. You're pointing out that there could be a reversion, but that the declines are less serious in terms of their magnitude than the previous declines that we saw in other reverse waves. Very good. And I'm going to entertain that possibility here in a moment with some data that we'll take a look at. I don't want to give it away, but I think that Lewis is on track here, suggesting that it's possible that there could be reversion, but still the endurance of more democratic features than usual. Joel says, I'm not sure if this is a reverse wave. I think systematic issues in democratic governments are bound to happen in young democracies. As we discussed last week, there is many reasons for the loss of democracy in another authoritarian government in the global politics. Global politics are interconnected. Joel makes an interesting point, and I think he's right too, to suggest that, look, the third wave left in its wake many young democracies, and these young democracies are bound to have some hiccups and bound to kind of have some wrinkles and to experience some backsliding from time to time. It could be that because those young democracies are quite young, we're experiencing some of that backsliding right now, and maybe there isn't a third reverse wave. It's just that the third wave has begun to ebb a little bit. Very good point, Joel. Giovanni says, I think we are experiencing a third reverse wave of democratization. We've had recent backslides in certain countries like Belarus, Turkey, and in certain aspects, India. It seems that many countries are embracing authoritarianism under strong leaders, crushing any political opposition and internal criticism while denying the civil rights of minority populations. Overall, I think that we need more time to see in what direction most countries will travel in the coming years. So Giovanni is kind of agreeing that, look, we might be at a critical juncture. We might need to wait to see what happens if there's a tipping point or if something happens in the short term that can kind of tilt us in one direction or another. Elion says, we could be experiencing a third wave of democratization due to the collective current events that have happened in such a short time that we haven't seen happen together before. I feel like we are living through a mixture of authoritarian action under democracy, but there is still a lot left to be determined. Yeah, so Elion's kind of picking up this thread weaved by many of the classmates, pointing out that like authoritarian actions are taking place within democracies. Those democracies are kind of teetering, but there's still a lot that hasn't happened and a lot of history that's been unwritten, so to speak. If we're witnessing a reversal, it could be that we're at the beginning or the very start of a process that's still sort of playing out. And so I like that we're doing such a good job recognizing where there's deterioration occurring, but how some democratic features are persisting. It's kind of like a mix of authoritarianism and democracy that doesn't necessarily totally deface the democracy, but might suggest that some of these regimes are teetering on the verge of reverting to authoritarian rule and giving kind of force to this reverse wave. Abby says, I do think there is a third reverse wave. However, I can definitely see the strong argument for why there isn't. There's a high amounts of democratic backsliding because there's a high amount of democratic countries. Good, Abby, good. Abby makes a point that no one has made yet, which is that, look, there are a lot of democracies after the third wave. The third wave of democratization saw the sort of introduction of the largest number of democracies ever in the world. And so that means that there are many more democracies that can experience backsliding. They may be experiencing reversions to authoritarian rule, or they may just be experiencing some slight backsliding. It could be that there are just so many democracies that we're bound to kind of notice a lot of these cases and maybe jump to the conclusion that there's a reversion. And so Abby, like many of the others, is kind of noticing that there are arguments on both sides and that we can see both perspectives. And this is what I want you to be able to do. And I'm very happy to see that so many of us are able to kind of take this nuanced view of the situation. And I'm going to now begin to work with you to kind of examine the data and to take a look at the actual patterns and take a look at the numbers and the way that they've changed and how they compare from one reverse wave to another. And so we're going to examine the following dimensions. We're going to take a look at some quantitative dimensions that relate to numbers and statistics and some of the proportions of the world that are democratic. And we're going to take a look at qualitative dimensions that refer to the kind of the nature and the quality and the characteristics of the democratic decline today versus the first two reverse waves. And so we're interested in a few key data points. First, we want to know what percentage of countries remain democratic today compared to at the troughs of the first two reverse waves. So what that means then is how many countries are democratic today compared to at the very bottom of the first two reverse waves. And so if we compare those numbers, we'll be able to get a good sense of what proportion of the world remains democratic versus not, and how that compares to earlier eras. And then we can also compare those numbers at the bottom of those reverse waves to the peaks of the first two waves. Excuse me, let me go back. We can compare the percentage of countries that remain democratic today to the percentage of countries at the peaks of the first two waves that were democratic. So this will give us a sense of how much has happened and how much has changed between these periods. We can also take a look at how many democratic regimes total have failed compared to at the bottoms of the first two reverse waves. And then finally, we want to take a look at the extent, the nature, and the pace of the declines that we associate with the recession of today. So let's take a look then. Let's take a look first at the similarities. And the similarities are mostly kind of qualitative. In the earlier episodes, the decline of a very high, unprecedented high number of democracies is underway. And so we're seeing a lot of democratic decline in a broad sense, as we've pointed out already. More countries are transitioning from democracy than to democracy. So like in earlier reverse waves, it is the case that more countries are moving in the opposite direction. This is leading to more authoritarian regimes, and it's leaving fewer consolidated democracies behind. So the world is changing in ways that are similar, in ways that constitute a move away from democracy. And as in previous reverse waves, the pattern accelerated a trend from a decade ago. Really 3 decades ago. In the 1990s, only 3 third wave democracies failed. This was sort of the beginning of what started to look like a decline, or the possibility of a period of decline. That pattern was accelerated substantially in the last 15 years, and especially in the last 5 or 6 years. And so in a broad sense, there are declines taking place. And we can say, even before dealing with any numbers, that in the same way that the previous reverse waves witnessed backsliding, we're witnessing backsliding. But I also want to leave you open to the possibility that the world remains still more democratic than ever before. And the numbers are actually quite compelling. And I want to pause and really emphasize the numbers that I'm going to give you right now. These are differences that come from the statistics and the proportions of democratic countries between these different periods. So get this. Today, more than 50% of all countries, that is all countries, including countries with fewer than 1 million people, more than 50% of all countries still qualify as democratic. So despite all the backsliding, despite all the reversions in individual countries, more than 50% of all countries still qualify as democratic. Now it's down from about 57% at its height, but it's still substantially higher than comparable numbers in earlier periods. So consider this. At the bottoms of the first 2 reverse waves, 19.7% and 24.6% of all countries were democratic. So that means then that relatively small proportions of countries were still democratic at the bottoms of those first 2 waves. Now, you may say that we have not yet reached the bottom of this reverse wave, and that 50% is going to go into decline, and that we'll go down to 40 or 30%. But that hasn't happened yet. And we're 14 years into what looks like a reverse wave. And so these numbers are pretty substantial and pretty important, because it suggests that even with a lot of backsliding, the world remains relatively democratic. It remains more democratic than not. But there are even more compelling numbers than those percentages. So consider this. At the peaks of the first 2 forward waves, not reverse waves, forward waves. At the peaks of the first 2 waves, 45.3% and 32.4% of all countries in the world were democratic. What that means is that even in the midst of this democratic decline that we find ourselves in today, more than 5% more of the world is still more democratic than at the very height of the first 2 pro-democracy waves. Even today, despite all the backsliding, the world is still more democratic than the world was at the very peaks of the first two waves. What that means then is that, put in perspective and put in context, what we're witnessing today might be far milder and might leave us still more democratic than we ever were, even in the best of times in earlier waves of democratization. Now, since 2006, around 12 democracies have failed. We've talked about these cases and we've read about them. And every one of those cases is a serious case. And each person in all of those countries is now probably worse off because of a transition from democracy in those places. But, put in perspective, it looks far less unsettling than the first two reverse waves. The first two reverse waves both saw 22 democracies fail. That compares to about 12 at present. And so, put in perspective, this period of democratic decline may be less serious, may be less substantial, less consequential than we thought. And it may cause us to pause for a moment and think about what the implications might be and what the future of the world might hold, and maybe what the condition of democracy is today. And so we can look at this depicted in a graph here. And what you see is that the global authoritarian transition rate has declined substantially over the course of about 100 years. What you can see is that the global share of democracies did change in 2006 and did enter into a period of decline. But what you see is that on whole, on balance, that period of decline looks a little bit smaller than some of those earlier periods of decline that we associate with earlier reverse waves. And you may point out that this one here doesn't look as big, but at least compared to the first reverse wave, this one looks substantially smaller. And it may draw into question whether we can call this a reverse wave at all. And I want you to notice then that over the course of time, we have seen so many democratic transitions that there are more democracies in the world than ever before. And what that means then is that there are more opportunities for backsliding. In those cases that do backslide may appear to be more serious or more consequential in the grand scheme of all countries than they may really be. And so a lot of you highlighted this and highlighted that the situation is a little bit different, and that there's a gradual nature here, and that there are maybe fewer cases of backsliding, even as there are differences in the type of reversals that we observe. So let's discuss a few more of those differences along the qualitative side of the debate. Now, it's not just the case that the nature of backsliding has changed. It's also the case that reversal in autocratization, have changed. The nature of these processes have changed. As some of you pointed out, it used to be the case that military coups would supplant democratically elected governments. It used to be the case that fascist movements would take over governments, and these processes would often be quite violent and disorderly and anything but democratic. And what that meant was that these processes were easy to identify empirically. It was really easy to pick out those cases that had lapsed and returned to authoritarian rule because the military had taken tanks to the streets and burned down the presidential palace. Easy enough. But that's not the way it is anymore. Democracies today erode gradually, and they erode under legal disguise. Executives concentrate power. They abuse legislative or other institutions from the inside out in order to tilt the playing field. In practice, they make competition less meaningful, and the multi-party characteristics of democratic regimes are often in decline in these settings, where more and more power is concentrated in the hands of the executive, and the powers of parties and other institutions begin to fall by the wayside. This process is so gradual and so delicate that it's actually really hard to kind of study and pinpoint where democracy is beginning to collapse and end, and where it is sustained. And so what we're seeing is that elites mimic democratic institutions while destroying their functions. And it makes it hard for us to know exactly where different systems are in the process of decline or reversal or backsliding, and what the future might hold and what exactly is happening in those cases. And so the quality and the characteristics of decline have also changed, in addition to the sheer numbers and the sheer proportions of countries that are in decline or that are experiencing some kind of backsliding. And so that's represented here. What we have is we have data from the pre-third wave between 1900 and 1993, and the data from the third wave, 1994 to 2017. These are the periods of backsliding that correspond to each of these periods of time, or each of these sort of historical windows. And what you see is that before the third wave, it was much more common for military coups, self-coups by executives who declare themselves the sole power. It was much more common for those types of events, along with invasions, to lead to regime changes. And these were very violent, very obvious events that were easily identifiable, and you could record them quite easily. But take a look at how much has changed between the prior period and the reversal period associated with the third wave. Much of the backsliding takes place in the form of democratic erosion. So these legal changes that tilt the playing field or rule out or bar opposition candidates from running for office, these kinds of things. And so the nature of regime failure has changed significantly, even if democratic regime failure is a characteristic of this period of reversal, just like it was previous periods. And so you can see then that, as many students pointed out, the nature of failure itself has changed. The nature of failure is now much, much more amorphous and kind of gray and really difficult to sort of pin down. It's possible that we'll see new forms of failure and new forms of executive abuse in the future that are even more adept and more nuanced than some of the ones that we've seen so far. But as you saw in the cases that we discussed last week, the last time we were in class, as you might remember on Monday, those cases all typically involve executive abuses. And those executive abuses range from changing electoral laws to try to bar opposition candidates, to abusing or critiquing or even ousting Supreme Court judges or senators. These kinds of movements that are kind of difficult to pin down and study in the same way, but that do indicate some kind of democratic decline. Now, let's discuss the final set of differences between the period that we witness today and earlier periods of reversal, before I put to you a question that may be the most important question going forward for all democracies and all authoritarian regimes the world over. And so this final set of differences relates to the precise extent to which some of these democracies have slid back to authoritarian rule. It may be the case that we're viewing a lot of transitions from democracy. 12 is a lot, even if it's a number smaller than other numbers during other periods of reversal. But the truth is that most of these episodes are weaker than their historical cousins. They're feebler. These represent breakdowns that are less serious and less grave than those of the past. This is at least the case for now. A lot could change. So what that means then is that the countries that are affected, even though they're affected, they remain more democratic than their equivalents hit by earlier reverse waves. And so, for instance, Hungary today is different than Italy under Mussolini. Hungary today might involve a concentration of power in the hands of the Fidesz government and Viktor Orban, but there still are more competitive elements and still more elements of opposition than there were under Italy's Mussolini. These periods of decline that we're witnessing now, generally speaking, are weaker. And so these democracies, or these former democracies, still remain more democratic than their equivalents during earlier reverse waves. And it's also the case, at last, that By the mid-1990s, as some students pointed out, most countries with conditions favorable to democracy had already democratized. And what that meant then was there were fewer countries that could potentially transition. And when there are fewer countries that can potentially transition, there will be fewer transitions. And so then that means that you have a lot of democracies that are all potentially subject to backsliding. And if you get, a handful or 12 or more than a dozen that do, it begins to look quite frightening. But again, the fact is, when so much of the world is democratic, there are that many more opportunities for failure or for backsliding. And so what this does then is this gives us a picture that is a little bit more complex than maybe we originally thought. It suggests that there is backsliding occurring, but it may not yet be a reverse wave, a full-blown reverse wave. It could be something else. And that something else might become a reverse wave. It might become something that's much more serious. And what we have before us is still serious, but what we have before us may not be a full-blown reversal just yet. It may be something else. It may be gradual deterioration. It may be gradual backsliding. It may be the weakening of some democratic regimes under difficult circumstances. What I'd like to conclude to you before I put a question to you is that the current trend of global democratic decline does not yet amount to a full-blown reverse wave of breakdowns, as Huntington conceived it. Huntington conceived of a reverse wave of democratic breakdowns as a large cluster, a grouping of democratic reversals. At least in terms of the way that he conceived of the first and the second reverse wave, the third reverse wave, if we'll call it that, is less of a reverse wave. It's not quite a reverse wave. It's something else. It's something smaller. It's some sort of cluster of regime backsliding incidents, but maybe something not quite on the order of the reverse waves that we saw earlier in history. But it's getting very, very close. And the exit sign is really nowhere in sight. And this is where I want to begin to think about the future. And I want to put it to you in a moment what the future may hold. But rest assured, or rest maybe unhappily, with the notion in the fact that things look pretty bad. Even if it's not a reverse wave of democratization, there doesn't appear to be an exit sign anywhere in sight. Now, November 3rd may be an exit sign for many of us in this country who may believe that what we're witnessing is a form of backsliding. But the world over, it's unclear where exactly we're going to go from here and where the exit sign might be and where the off-ramp might be. And what we'll learn as we go forward is that an important part of this escape from autocracy has to be electoral victories, in defeating authoritarians at the polls and beating them in elections. And this is a component of the process that must remain intact. It's always going to be easier for us to beat autocrats at the polls on election day democratically, because then we can resurrect the democracy and we can embolden and shore up those institutions that we depend on, or that those of us who promote democracy depend on, to keep the playing field level and competitive. Now, we can conclude a few other things that are just as important. Even if we're not witnessing a reverse wave, what we see is that democratization is far from a linear process. It is not a linear process. There are stops and goes and abrupt disruptions and half starts. And the entire process is beset with hiccups and difficulties and some backsliding. New democracies are subject to backsliding. They just are. Even old democracies are. The point is, democratization, both transition and consolidation, is not linear. It is not linear. The trajectory is never going to be linear because there are unanticipated changes that can interrupt that process. Democracies are subject to backsliding. They always will be. This is endemic to democracies, just as authoritarian regimes are subject to transitions to democracy. And more broadly still, I want to put to you that history may have no end. If anything, it may be that history repeats itself. Because if we're witnessing backsliding yet again after what was the most incredible transformation and set of democratizations the world has ever seen in the third wave, that means that we're repeating history. We're going back, we're reverting to earlier patterns of backsliding that maybe we thought were a product of the past and would never, ever, ever be duplicated. And so when we come up to this and we really face it for what it is, let's face it, we're staring into the abyss. And what happens next will tip the scale in favor of either democracy or authoritarianism. And what happens next is yet to be told. It could be anything. This is a critical moment, a critical juncture. This is a window of time where the constraints on action have been lifted for both the pro-democratic and the anti-democratic forces. And who will seize the moment and fill the void is a question, an open question. And this abyss that we're staring into may not be the end point. Even if we wind up in that abyss, it could be that democracy is resurrected. In fact, it almost is inevitable that it will be someday. But where we are now is a critical moment, and what happens next will tip the scale. And I actually want to turn it over to you now. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes. And I want to ask you, what will happen next? Will the world become more or less democratic? And why? And I'm going to sit back and I'm going to look forward to your input, and I look forward to reading your input in anything that you'd like to share. If you want to take the floor and make a comment, you can do that as well. But we do have a few minutes, and I want to invite you to answer this question based on your perspective and kind of your understanding of the situation. So Yohel says, I don't think history repeats itself. To say that means events are inevitable. History does serve as a guide. In the looks of it, that guide isn't being used. Okay. So it could be that actors make deliberate choices and learn from history themselves, but that history just by nature doesn't itself repeat itself. It could be that history contains actors who have similar ideas and who learn from each other. I think that's a good point, Yohel. Thank you. Arturo says, breaking news might be a bit off topic, but the current US president is encouraging people in North Carolina, a battleground state, to vote twice. That would be an example of deterioration under legal disguise. Or maybe not under legal disguise, because that's clearly not legal. So interesting. Ishan says, I think that the world is going to continue to backslide due to the lack of checks and balances to some of the largest non-democratic countries that are becoming large regional powers. China and Russia, for example, are able to intervene on behalf of chaos in places such as Syria, and India's economy is booming despite the sliding to authoritarianism. So Ishan is pointing out that, look, a lot of these authoritarian regimes that might be the ones who fill the void and propel the world towards authoritarian rule are actually often quite effective in bringing about what they want to bring about and in doing what they want to do. And often as international powers, they're very influential and they can have quite an impact beyond their borders. That's certainly relevant, right? These are power brokers in the world order, and it would serve them well to create little authoritarian regimes that align with them all over the place. And so, surprise, surprise, Russia has identified weakening US democracy as advantageous to Russia. So it's true, I think. Evan says, I'm worried that as climate change gets worse in the coming decades, more countries will revert to authoritarianism. It's possible, Evan, because if people become more desperate because of the consequences of climate change, they're probably going to be more likely to become discontented with democracy and to put their faith in authoritarian alternatives, in populists, in illiberal populists who discredit and weaken those democratic institutions. So yeah, it's true. Unfortunately, though crisis always would seem to benefit the most from a democratic resolution, the truth is the crises usually strengthen authoritarian alternatives and weaken democratic forces because people become impatient with democracy and they want something rapid and decisive, whatever that might be. And that's normally authoritarian rule. Samantha says, I personally think that a lot of these democracies were not good enough. This is why it was so easy for them to revert back to authoritarian rule. I believe in the power of the people, so I think it will become more democratic. That's a good point, Samantha. We know that those new democracies are going to be weaker by definition, and they may be more subject to backsliding than other democracies, especially older ones. And so when you say that they might not be good enough, that's a fair point. You know, they might not have met the requirements in the criteria for full democracies, or even relatively full democracies. And Samantha actually makes an important point, and raises an important point. In coming days, we're actually going to deal with indicators and ways of measuring democracy and differentiating between less democratic and more democratic regimes. And so Samantha's point is one that we'll see raised again, and we'll take a look at the extent to which some of these new democracies were or were not democratic. Now, everyone, we are out of time. And before you go, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be sending an updated version of the syllabus that accounts for Labor Day. And so I'm going to be sending that very soon, tomorrow, probably tomorrow. And I'd like you to save a copy of that. I'll upload a copy as well, but it will have some slight changes accounting for Labor Day. Now, as we come to a close here, you're welcome to go. If you have questions, you can stick around and ask me questions through the chat or through the mic, and I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I am recording this, and I'll stop recording it, and I'll upload the lecture as well, and also the slides. So all of that material will be available to you. And again, I'll stick around for a while to answer questions, but if you are good to go, you're welcome to go. I hope you have a nice evening, and thank you very much for all of your input.